This is Fritz Meyer in the week of May 5th, and I wanted to go through last week's economic data. There was a lot of economic data last week. The stock market is rallying based on Friday's jobs report. But let's go through the first quarter GDP report first. And you can see in this slide where the cursor is that first quarter GDP was reported at minus 0.2%. Even though fundamental consumer spending in the United States was healthy, a large surge in imports takes away from calculated GDP. The reason I wanted to show this slide is to illustrate that despite the contraction in first quarter GDP, most economists surveyed in the April Wall Street Journal survey of economists believe that we'll have a continuation of economic expansion following that negative first quarter GDP report. Plotted in this chart, you can see how the GDP actually is a very constant growth function, trending up a 2.3% trend line rate of growth. And again, in the dotted red line in this chart, you can see how most economists believe we're going to have a slowing in GDP growth, but probably turn up and follow that long-term trend rate of growth.
Brett?
And the reason I make this point is because it's important to understand that the economy in the United States is driven by a fundamental set of drivers: growth in the working population and growth in productivity gains. And so despite some temporary disruptions caused by the tariffs, I think that it's safe to assume economic expansion will resume along this trend rate of 2.3% because the fundamental drivers of economic growth don't change over time. And that's a reason to be optimistic.
Question.
Here was a very interesting screen grab that I did last Wednesday when first quarter GDP was released. And what I'm referring to are the blue data series, the most recent as of Wednesday, CNBC's flash rapid update. And whereas the first quarter was reported to be a negative 0.3% in this slide, although I believe the number is minus 0.2%, these economists believe we'll have a rebound in the second quarter to 1.6%, followed by continued expansion thereafter. And the point that CNBC was making is that what a huge difference 100 days makes. In other words, from Liberation Day, the imposition of these tariffs, the expectation for economic expansion has been dramatically reduced since April 1. And although no recession in the forecast. Along similar lines, the Atlanta Fed's GDP Now, published May 1st, is for 1.1% GDP growth in the second quarter. And you can also see in this chart where the blue chip consensus of economists currently resides, a little bit less than 1%. That's about 1.8%. I'm sorry, 0.8% estimated GDP growth for the second quarter. The New York Fed also has a econometric model entitled Nowcast, and they're predicting 2.3% GDP growth in the second quarter. And interestingly, is what I'm pointing to is the third quarter. Oh, they don't have the third quarter. So sorry, strike that. But a very healthy 2.3% GDP growth estimated for the second quarter, the current quarter. Also released last week was disposable personal income and personal spending. These are very important numbers. 70% of the GDP is incorporated in the black line in this data series, personal outlays, up 5.5% year over year. And that's as compared to 2.3% inflation. So Americans are continuing to grow their spending at a very healthy after inflation clip of about 3 percentage points. The personal consumption expenditures deflator measure of inflation was released with the personal income and spending report. And as I just pointed out, 2.3% is the current headline number for inflation on the PCED. So we're getting towards the Fed's 2% target. As I've said on the monthly webinars, I think for all intents and purposes, the Fed has accomplished its job of getting inflation down. I don't think investors care particularly if we hit 2% or not. Somewhere between 2 and 3%, I think, is acceptable to most investors. But in any event, you can see the good progress that's been made in the month of March on this measure. Last week also saw the release of the April jobs report, 177,000 net new jobs gained, and that probably more than anything else is responsible for the market reacting favorably. Stocks traded up last week by a substantial amount. And at 177, you can see that's consistent with the decade-long period here during which we experienced healthy GDP growth and healthy job gains. Of all of the monthly economic data, this is probably the most important, and this was taken very positively. The average hourly earnings figure in this chart of 3.8%, again, compared to 2.3% inflation, suggests that Americans are achieving or realizing real wage gains. But the downward trend in this data series is favorable from the Fed's standpoint in that we're experiencing less wage-driven inflation, hence it's a disinflationary statistic. And the unemployment rate at 4.2% held constant from the March number, suggesting the U.S. economy really is at virtually full employment. And so in my mind, there's a real question as to why the administration feels we need to create a lot of new jobs when we're at full employment. And I don't think we need new jobs. Speaking of job openings, that figure was also released last week. At 7.2 million job openings. It's come down from over 10 million job openings, but it's still, that statistic still equals the number of unemployed job seekers. So it's still a fairly favorable position, even though the two data series have now converged, because the historic norm, as you can see in this chart, is for there to be many more unemployed job seekers than there are job openings. So in recent years, as you can see, the black line has surpassed the red line, which has been a very favorable position for new job formation. So we're still at a point where the two equal one another. And that concludes this summary.
Fritz, going back to that first slide, what you said about calculating GDP was really, I hadn't looked at it that way before. So what you're saying is that because there was a rush to get new orders in before the tariffs, that is like almost a point for point deduction against GDP. Could you just explain that math?
Let's go back to the basic equation. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. So consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. when imports surge back up, net exports is computed by taking exports minus imports. So if the imports number is a big number, suddenly the net exports calculation becomes a big negative number. And so that's what takes away from C plus I plus G. Then the net exports figure is a big negative number. And that's what happened in the first quarter. And just for the reason that you said, people rushing to buy ahead of tariffs. And most economists believe that will reverse in the second.
It will reverse next quarter is the hope, because there'll be a change in policy.
That rush to buy imports will subside.
And but the math on that's really interesting, how it's like has such a dramatic effect. But it seems like the theme from what's happening right now in a number of areas is there are a lot of new, unusual things happen that we haven't experienced in years or maybe ever. It seems some of this they're anomalies, and they're a little more complex than the usual anomalies in some ways.
Absolutely. I've never seen economists so confused over the outlook. And again, just look at this slide where economists are now forecasting 0.5% GDP growth in the third quarter, compared to this slide where economists are forecasting much better than that. And so I think economists are really confused as to how to sort this out, because we've never seen the imposition of tariffs before like this. And so the professionals in the economics profession just don't know how to forecast it. But it seems to me I remain relatively optimistic despite the GDP arithmetic, because I think fundamentals demand will remain pretty strong. I think consumer spending in the United States, which in the end is really the important variable, will remain pretty robust. And that's because of the job situation. And unless the jobs numbers really start to turn down, I think consumer spending will hold up. And so you have the net export calculation on top of that, and that's the wild card. So I'd be in the camp that says no recession, but an increasing number of economists are raising their probabilities of recession. And a lot of them just don't know what's going to happen.
And I wonder whether the Fed algorithms are very useful right now, because do they even account in any way for tariffs?
And I don't know that they do.
I'll look into that.
Yeah. And by the way, the Atlanta Fed was, I guess you could say, they were a little more accurate in their first quarter GDP forecast. Remember, they had a negative number. And it turns out they were correct on that compared to the New York Fed's model.
Oh, did not realize that.
Yeah. Although Atlanta Fed was at minus 1.6%, and the actual came in at minus 0.2%. Still, they were negative side of the ledger. So they accounted for the big surge in imports a little bit better than the New York Fed's model did.
Yeah. And your other comment struck me was, you don't understand why the administration wants so many more new jobs. That's unusual. Usually don't you always want new jobs?
Say that again. I'm sorry.
Your comment struck me as odd, that you don't understand why the administration wants so many more new jobs when we have enough jobs.
You always want more new jobs, but the economy on a trend line basis keeps creating new jobs. But incrementally, I don't think we need a whole bunch of new manufacturing jobs, for example, which would layered on top of the normal rate of job creation would, I think, create inflation.
A labor shortage?
Yeah, you'd have a labor shortage.
Like I said, it's a lot of new, different problems that,
Yes.
that are coming up in conversation. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. And we'll see you on May 13th, Tuesday